Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
Animal agriculture is vital to Nebraska. Livestock production not only contributes to our food supply, but also helps our rural communities. Livestock provides revenue for schools, creates jobs, supports Main Street, and enhances the future for farm families. The Nebraska Soybean Board's Animal Agriculture Initiative works to encourage growth of responsible livestock enterprises to benefit agriculture and Nebraska.
Market Journal, television for making agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Extension, where you can know how, know now. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, Roy Smith takes a look at the corn and soybean markets. Charles Shapiro explains why Nebraska soil tests are finding varying rates of nitrogen. Emerson Nafziger describes his research on crop rotation. And Susanna von Essen talks about the pulmonary health in today's farmers. Roy Smith is our marketing analyst this week. We spoke with Roy Wednesday afternoon and began by asking how the looming reports on quarterly grain stocks and prospective plantings affect seasonal price trends.
Normally this time of the year we're looking at an uptrend in corn and soybean prices both, and so far that's been the case up until the last 2 or 3 days. I guess the issue this time is number one, the tightness of the corn supply here in Nebraska and other places where there's a lot of demand for corn. And the other issue is the South American harvest of soybeans and how soon they're going to make it into the U.S. market. So, we've got a couple of big unknowns here to deal with, notwithstanding the fact that most years we're seeing the market in an uptrend this time of year.
Well, what's your mindset with corn? I'll get to soybeans in a second, but corn found a little help after last Friday's report. However, there's some fear going into that quarterly stocks report that things might not end on the right way if you do end up holding your corn.
Well, the last report we had was friendly to corn, and we saw the result of that here in the last couple of weeks. And I guess it's kind of a cat and mouse game as to what you want to believe and what you feel about the corn market. I mean, here in eastern Nebraska in Cass County, there's very little corn left in the bins. Most people took their corn to the elevated harvest time because the crop was short and it was dry and so forth. And so, that's reflected in a dynamite basis. I mean, the basis of here at the Midwest Co-op of 17 over nearby futures. Now, I think the question then you have to ask is this true nationwide? And if it is, when is the market going to recognize that and continue the rally?
So you're not going to jump on either side of the fence right now for me?
Well, I'm looking for a rally to sell into, and we're getting awfully close. We got close to 750 cash here about a week ago, and so I still have optimism that we'll be able to do that, or maybe a little better. I don't know if we can get back to $8 or not, but somewhere in that 750 to 8 range would probably start moving some corn out of the bins, what little bit is left.
I'll ask you about beans here, and my question is this: if you go back to last fall, and there were a lot of analysts that thought spring was going to be the high before the South American crop came in, and that South American crop is now well under harvest, and the reports are that it's quite good. So, if you're bullish in beans, what are you arguing on? Are you arguing that there's going to be a lot of demand for it, or you're arguing that there's going to be weather concerns here?
Well, first of all, I think you have to recognize that the basis is good on beans also, which indicates demand. And so if we're playing a game of chicken with this soybean market. We know that the supply from last year was very tight. We know that the South American crop is coming. We're not sure how big that is, but we also have the unknown of the U.S. production environment. Are we going to have enough rain to give us a chance for a good crop, or are we going to go from shower to shower and maybe not have a good crop? And so we got a lot of things in the mix there. And most of my beans were sold last fall on the dead cat bounce. That's a practice that I always use. I've got about 10% left to gamble with, and right now I'd say it really is a gamble. You're almost flipping a three-face coin to see which one of those scenarios you're going to follow.
Is there anything that you're looking for, or any kind of run you're looking for?
I would look cash somewhere in the $15 to $16 area as a time that might encourage me to quit gambling and cash in on the rest of them. But everybody's got their own level. Everybody's got their own profit potential. First of all, look at what your potential for raising a crop is, and if you can make money with that discount, why, then some sales might be warranted. Personally, I'm considering the moisture conditions here in the dryland part of the state and the amount of discount and the amount of risk there is, I'm not willing to make any sales right now. But if you are going to make sales, one thing you for sure want to do, and that is leave the basis open, because there's a tremendous discount in the basis looking at new crop 2013 beans. And so selling hedge to arrive contract or selling on the futures market makes a lot more sense than a cash forward contract.
Next week, we'll look at the livestock markets with UNL's new extension economist, Kate Brooks. The USDA clarified this week how they intend to furlough meat inspectors as a result of budget cuts. There was much uncertainty regarding the continuity of meat processing after the recent budget sequester. Beginning sometime in July, the USDA says it will furlough meat inspectors for an expected 11 non-consecutive days before the end of September. The agency hopes the shutdowns across the country at the same time will provide the least amount of disruption to the industry. Drought conditions during the 2012 growing season affected not only plants above the ground, but they're also having an impact on the nutrients below the soil's surface. UNL Extension soil scientist Charles Shapiro joined us earlier this week to talk about the varying levels in recent soil tests, including the amount of nitrogen found in sampled fields.
In our dryland crops where they were very droughty, most of the samples, or a lot of the samples coming in, are showing high levels of nitrate, which makes sense because the crop did not remove it and there was very little or no leaching. So what was put down last May or June is still there.
What about the irrigated crops that really did pretty well across the state?
Yeah, they should have used a fair amount of the N that was applied, and they might have even used more N than was applied. In that case, what we probably have had was increased mineralization. In other words, the natural soil organic matter, when it gets irrigated weekly, like a lot of fields were last year, the microbes are working full speed, and so they actually mineralize more N than in a normal year. So what we're thinking is that it's very field by field, but there may be a fair amount of N even in some high-yielding fields because of the warm weather and the water that was put on through irrigation.
When you say that the levels are high, especially in those dryland areas, how high? I mean, how much different from a normal year are they?
We would normally think that there could be 3 to 5 parts per million in the surface, and some of people are reporting 10 to 15, which would mean that maybe there's 50 to 100 pounds in the surface compared to normally maybe 50 in the whole profile. It really depends on the situation, and so you need to take a soil sample to find out what's in your field. But if you can find 50 pounds of extra N, the cheapest N that you could buy these days is probably around 50 cents a pound. So 50 pounds of N is $25. It certainly would pay to utilize what is already there.
Right. Describe to me where in that profile it is. I mean, is it all in that surface in the first few inches, or is there more down below?
What they're finding from those who have sampled is that it's mostly in the top 8 inches, maybe the top foot. And so as we normally recommend taking a 0 to 8, 8 to 24, maybe 24 to 36-inch sample, getting a full view of the profile. In this year, this may be an exceptional year where the top foot would be adequate. Since we're finding very little N below the top foot, one could sample the top foot and assume very little below it and make the calculations that way.
What are you recommending for application, whether it be before planting, with plant side dressing? I mean, what's the recommendation this year based on what you expect to see?
If there's a lot of nitrogen in that top foot, then one could put some N on early, 30 pounds, either partially in the starter or with a herbicide, just to kind of cover non-uniformity, get the crop going. Once the roots are established, it would take that in, and then based on your yield goal and other factors, you could side dress in the rest of it.
What about the other nutrients in the soil? What are you seeing there? Anything abnormal?
On my experiments up here at the Northeast Station, we're pretty much dry land, and I have 2 long-term studies that I've been testing basically the same plots for 10, 20 years. And in those areas in the field, I'm seeing an increase of maybe 10 part per million phosphorus, which is above and beyond what one would expect by either crop removal or added P last year. So the dry weather has done something to the chemistry. So if you are sampling the fields, or farmers have sampled fields and they see some higher than what they would expect levels, I would either resample or use your old samples, or just use caution. They probably haven't risen as much as maybe the soil test would indicate.
Charles says the fluctuating test levels suggest it's important to check residual nitrate levels in fields this spring, both following corn and soybeans in 2012. If fields were tested last fall, Charles says those results should still be fairly accurate since this winter hasn't been overly wet or warm. At the World Soybean Research Conference in South Africa, we spoke with Emerson Nafziger from Illinois about his research in crop rotation. Emerson is looking at profit returns on corn, soybeans, and wheat rotations, as well as corn on corn and soybeans on soybeans. When I asked what led him to the study, Emerson said he was interested in it because it was something that farmers wouldn't normally experiment with by themselves.
Back in the 90s, I had some sort of inspiration, and I said, well, if we don't start this, we're never going to have it out here for a long enough time. And I think there are real questions. We've sort of locked ourselves in today to a corn-soybean rotation. It's almost all we grow in the corn belt now.
You're at 2 locations in Illinois where you're doing this research at. You're looking at continuous corn, you're looking at corn, wheat, soybeans, corn, soybeans, wheat. What do your results show?
Over the 15 years we've been running these, the 2 locations have looked a little more similar than I thought they would. Continuous corn has certainly averaged less yield than rotated corn. We kind of expected that, but the percentage yield losses in this are larger than we've normally used as our rule of thumb. And I'm a little surprised at that. We tend to remember the good years better than the poor years, but we've had half of the years there, we've taken a pretty good yield hit on continuous corn, and the continuous corn stays in the same plots. And in a really good year, it will yield up with the others, and they'll all yield 225 or 30. So we're kind of surprised to see that, even after some good years, you get a little drought stress or something, and suddenly continuous corn, now under rain-fed conditions, if we could have irrigated them, I really think we'd have pretty much equivalent yields all the time.
What about your price return? You looked at some variable costs and tried to factor that in a little bit. Give me an idea of what that looked like.
Well, it was kind of a crude effort to be an economist, but it's pretty simple to subtract seed costs and fertilizer costs, and we get these out of our farm business records in Illinois, so we didn't just make them up. We generally found that at both locations, the corn-soybean rotation, just 1 year of each, like we've practiced for a long time, it's our most common rotation, and by our reckoning, it looks like it's one of the best ones in terms of return. Now, if you can raise corn without a big yield loss compared to rotated corn, then continuous corn becomes the most profitable, because corn does have the highest profit potential today. It's just that if we're going to live with, a 15 or 20% yield loss over years like we saw at the one location, then that really sort of changes the equation and says, should we really do this?
Finally, what about the tillage options that you looked at? Was there any discernible difference there?
tillage made less difference than we thought it would. I guess what we would say is it's just not very consistent. And I suppose when you think about it, we'd sort of expect that, you know, a good year with good rainfall, crop comes up and does well, never runs out. You know, tillage doesn't tend to make very much difference. In our conditions, you know, we don't have to do tillage to get good yields. And if you averaged over everything we did, you know, tillage made less difference than we thought it would. And we're comparing sort of conventional tillage with, we're not moldboard plowing, but comparing that with no-till. And if you're not in an erosive soil, it doesn't look like, you know, you're going to save a lot or make a lot more money by doing no-till. Still, I think some people are doing it successfully. It works really well for them. It does cut costs and you know, it cuts time in the field. And people that are making no-till work, I think that's a pretty good option. But it doesn't look in our highly productive soils, it doesn't look like tillage is going to be you know, clearly move us one way or the other on that. I do think that, you know, tillage is being maybe just a little bit overdone now. We see people making 2 trips in the fall, and almost every field, I think, in Illinois that was corn has been tilled, and by now, and a lot of them that were soybeans have been tilled. So there doesn't seem to be much slowdown in the producers wanting to go out and till.
We'll bring you more from the conference next week, including our conversation with Thomas Mielke from Oil World in Hamburg, Germany. Unless rainfall during spring is more than average, there's a strong chance many pastures across Nebraska will be less than adequate. UNL Extension forage specialist Bruce Anderson says one option for more summer pasture is to plant summer annual forage grasses like sorghum, sudan grass, and millets. But you may need to act quickly to lock up seed.
It seems early to be talking about these summer grasses since we usually don't plant them until late May or June. But if you think you might need to use these grasses to supply forage for your cattle this year, buy your seed soon. The seed of these grasses is grown mostly in Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Colorado. Drought during the past couple years greatly reduced production and, as a result, the supply available for this summer.
Bruce says foxtail millet appears to be in the shortest supply, with most dealers already sold out. He states the bottom line is this: if you think you might want or need to plant summer annual forage grasses this year, buy the seed now before it's all gone. Last year's drought may have prevented severe Goss's wilt infestations in Nebraska corn, but a UNL Extension plant pathologist says don't let your guard down. The March, Nebraska farmer carries a warning from Tamara Jackson-Zims. Goss's wilt is here to stay. The corn disease continues to spread east and north in the Corn Belt and has become one of the top diseases of corn. As the best management practice, Jackson-Zims recommends producers plant hybrids that carry resistance to Goss's wilt. You can read more about the disease in the March, Nebraska Farmer. At last week's Triumph of Ag Expo in Omaha, we talked with Dr. Susanna von Essen from the University of Nebraska Medical Center about pulmonary issues in today's farmers. You'll hear in our conversation the improvement hog farmers are seeing in their respiratory health and how manure may be able to protect you from lung cancer. Since planting season is around the corner, we started by asking Susanna about application precautions for farm chemicals.
Probably the farm chemical that poses the biggest risk to you is anhydrous ammonia. And if everything's working right, you're going to be fine. But if a hose breaks or something else happens where you get a face full of it, you may start coughing and wheezing immediately.
What are some of the other precautions you could take if you're just working around other types of chemicals? Are there things that you need to be aware of?
Well, there's some evidence that certain farm chemicals, certain pesticides cause asthma. There's evidence from the agricultural health study suggesting that. So the best way to protect yourself is to follow all those rules that you learned when you took the classes so that you could buy the chemicals, those safety rules, wear the personal protective equipment they talk about in those classes, and you probably will be fine.
What are the problems with grain dust? What are the dangers?
The biggest risk is organic dust toxic syndrome. That is the most common risk.
And what does that do? What does it mean?
Well, you get a heavy grain dust exposure. Maybe you're cleaning a bin. That evening you think you're coming down with the flu. You have fever and chills and body aches and a headache. And all that can be from this inflammatory response that your body is making related to that heavy grain dust exposure.
So what do you need to do to prevent that? Is it just as simple
Wear
as
a
a mask?
respirator.
It's as simple as that.
It's as simple as wearing a respirator.
This grain that you're talking about, is it grain that has spoiled, or is it just normal grain?
It's more likely if the grain looks like it's spoiled, but it can happen just from normal grain.
If you look at the problems that hog farmers are having in barns, describe to me the evolution of how it used to be a problem and what kind of a problem it is now.
We used to see about 30% of hog farmers having respiratory problems. They would get chest tightness and cough, what we call the asthma-like syndrome, or they might get chronic bronchitis where they make a lot of phlegm. Now, we just aren't seeing as many in our clinical practices, like my pulmonary practice. Also, there just aren't any workers' comp claims being filed for respiratory problems related to hog farming.
Any hypothesis as to why that might be?
I think it's because ventilation's gotten a lot better in the barns. We know it has to be better for the pigs. We now have these big fans, the tunnel ventilation systems, the curtains that go up and down. So I think that's made a positive impact on the respiratory health of the farmers as well. I'd like to test that. I'd like to get some funding and do the study, but I'm fairly sure that's true based on my subjective impression from being a pulmonary practitioner in Nebraska.
Talk to me about the lung cancer in farmers, because this is an interesting study in how manure may be valuable in some way.
Yet another way that manure can be good.
Right.
It seems to protect you. If you raise animals on your farm, it may protect you. It seems to have a strong protective effect actually against lung cancer. And it's probably from the endotoxin, which is from the cell membrane of E. coli and other gram-negative bacteria that are highly abundant in manure. You do also get this effect if you simply have row crops on your farm, because you have endotoxin in large amounts in grain dust from bacteria like Klebsiella that are common in stored grain.
Overall, what are some of the simple precautions that farmers can take to protect their respiratory system?
Anytime there's going to be a lot of dust in the air and you know the circumstance, wear a two-strap dust mask, what's called an N95 mask. They're available maybe locally at your grain elevator, maybe from the veterinarian's office, from Gemplers, from maybe Tractor and Supply. Moldex is one brand. 3M makes a very nice, equally effective product that's made right in Valley, Nebraska. So you have lots of choices.
Now with his weekly weather forecast, here's UNL Extension State Climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here we are for the weekly forecast. Before we get to the main forecast, let's look at how we blew this storm from last week. The upper air low was expected to move through last week and produce a widespread area of precipitation across the state in the order of around an inch. We did see some locations that met that criteria. Basically, we had some heavy snowfall fall from the western sandhills southwestward toward the Imperial region, but in advance of that snow in that region, we had a dry slot develop across west central into portions of central Nebraska. And then as that upper air low moved eastward, we did see some thunderstorms developing in the south central through central Nebraska region. And then as that system entirely moved through the state, stalled over central Iowa, and we've seen a long-lived snow event across portions of eastern Nebraska and portions of central and east central into southeastern Nebraska, anywhere from about 3 inches central to upwards of 8-9 inches across extreme eastern Nebraska. So it was very welcome moisture, but unfortunately some areas did miss out on the precipitation. Now there's several more chances of moisture as we go forward, as we're in a very active pattern. So let's hope that the models will be a little bit more correct in terms of their predicted output from this moisture. And let's go to the upper air models to see how this is going to play out. And the first thing I'll draw your attention to is the snowstorm that hit the northern plains through the southeast is starting to push some of the colder air toward our south. So we are going to see much cooler conditions than we have the past few days, where we were well across the 60s across much of the state. But as the system moves eastward, we may see some precipitation break out across the panhandle. It looks to be very light. It may increase in intensity as we get into the overnight hours, and there is some signs that we may see some accumulating snowfall across the northern panhandle, possibly into the southern panhandle, but right now it only looks to be in the 1 to 2 inch range. Now as we go into tomorrow, we'll start to see a system much stronger diving into the central Rockies, and then that's going to rapidly move eastward. So we're going to start to see precipitation break out from west to east, and it'll increase in intensity as the day progresses. Not a big precipitation maker, but we may may see a 1/4 to a 1/2 inch in some locations. And as the system moves through during the overnight hours, we could see some snow accumulations once again across the northern half of the state. But again, it's looking like it's going to be in the 1 to 2 inch range. By the time we get to Monday, this system's going to really start to energize itself as it moves eastward. Going to pull in some pretty cold air behind it. So there might be a brief shot of snow across the east, but it doesn't look like anything significant, and it'll probably be out of the region by the time we get to the midday on Monday. As we get into Tuesday, we'll start to see the ridge trying to rebuild back in, bringing warmer weather to the southwestern part of the state. Much cooler conditions as it's closer to the core of this very cool conditions moving into the eastern Corn Belt. So we'll be looking at highs in the mid-30s. As we go to Wednesday, it looks like everybody should be sunny, but we'll pay attention to this storm system that's going to rapidly drop into the central Rockies and represent our next significant chance of moisture. And as we get into Thursday, we'll see the system drop down. We'll start to see moisture in advance of this system, so we could see some fairly widespread light precipitation across the state, with more intense precipitation probably starting to break out as we get into Friday, bringing very cold conditions in. We could see the potential for some significant snow accumulations with this system. This is one to pay attention to, and as the system moves eastward, is expected to stall out. It's giving us an extended period of off and on precipitation that might last 4 or 5 days. Now let's take a look at the temperature forecast. Warmest temperatures will be this weekend, and then we'll see a cooling trend as that frontal system moves to the east of us. And as we get into later next week, we'll start to see the temperatures increase in advance of that system. But notice as we get into Friday, cooler conditions start to develop in the northwest with a chance of snowfall, and that may spread across much of the state as we get into next weekend. Let's look at the forecast for 8 to 14-day forecast next Thursday the following Tuesday. Very cold conditions in terms of precipitation. Looks to be above normal for a vast majority of the state.
Thanks, Al. Our interviews with Roy Smith, Charles Shapiro, Emerson Nafziger, and Susanna von Essen are available as part of the March 15th episode of Market Journal on the show's website. Next week, Kate Brooks will be our livestock marketing analyst, and Thomas Mielke from Oil World will discuss the global soybean situation. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board. The Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln Extension, where you can know how, know now. Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Soybean Board.
America's export of soybeans helps the U.S. maintain a positive agricultural trade balance. Nebraska contributes half of its soybeans for export. The protein and oil content in soybeans enhance the growing demand for higher protein diets. The Nebraska Soybean Board promotes research to develop new soybean varieties with higher protein and oil content for major agricultural markets. The Nebraska Soybean Checkoff, growing opportunity from the ground up.